Okay, well, welcome everyone. My name is Gene Rice. I'm the chair of the philosophy department at Fort Hays, and we're excited to have you here. A nice mix of faculty members, students, and members of the community here at large. So, senior thesis is the culmination of an awful lot of work. It's the culmination of our degree program, but also kind of the personal culmination for the students' work in philosophy. So it's a lot of years, a lot of writing papers, a lot of taking tests. And so while we're here partly as an assessment of Carol's work, it's also partly a celebration of her work here in the philosophy department and with our faculty. So again, thanks for being here. A couple of notes about how we'll work this procedurally. Carol has about 15 minutes to present her paper, or the key findings of her research paper. So the research paper is some 25 pages, and we have a few extra copies, and we can make some more if you'd like one later. But so if you have a clarification question for Carol, that's fine. You can raise your hand and ask that. But we'll hold big questions, objections, rebuttals until the presentation is over. So after 15 or 20 minutes, we'll open it up to questions, and then for the rest of the time, Carol will be in charge of calling on people, but you just raise your hand. And we'll have a debate and discussion for the last 40 minutes or so of the presentation. So I can't think of anything else to say, except again, thank you for being here. And I'll turn it over to Carol, whose title is Gender Performance? Better Understanding the Gender Controversy.
So I've been studying this about 2 years, and I chose the title because of sometimes gender is called a performance, and some people are confused about why we would call it a performance or why some things about the gender controversy, and I'm trying to explain what the main points of the arguments are and where people are getting confused and disagree. So the main two structures I want to talk about are the essentialists and the constructionist. So essentialists hold that sexual orientation is an objective, intrinsic, and culturally independent property of persons. So they focus on the cultural and historical. So you've probably heard of the heterosexual-homosexual controversy that the essentialists would say that there were homosexuals or heterosexuals back in the Greek times or earlier times, and while the constructionists would say it's a conceptual identity that wasn't until recent times, such as when the word Protestant is a term that was coined back in the 16th century, and homosexual was coined in the 19th century. And then I'm going to focus more on essentialists that have a biological emphasis for gender and sex, and then the constructionist, while the two feminists that I'll be talking about, they do not deny a biological basis for gender, but they rather see it as a mix of many factors instead of just one or two things, for example. And then it's helpful to lay out some terms. The four main terms that are used, like sex, is referring to either male or female, and then there's a small percentage of people that are biologically indeterminate, whether they're clearly male or female. And then there's gender identity, is whether you identify as a male or female, or there could be multiple identities, and that would be complex to explain. And then, by the way, this on the left side here is the American Psychological Association's definition of sex and gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation, which is a very common definition. Gender expression would be the expression or your actions, whether you're that would be more with performance, whether you're male or female. expression, and then sexual orientation. The American Psychological Association sees it as a subset of identity, which the orientation we're referring to, attracted to men, attracted to women, or some are attracted to both sexes, or some people are asexual, have no interest in it at all. Make sure I got the right one here. Okay, and as far as sexual orientation, it was actually Sigmund Freud that is believed to have coined the term, and he thought of it as a expression of your or part of your core self, that just about most or all things had some kind of sexual motivation behind it. And as one hilarious example, I think, was Dr. Thomas Sawes gave an example from one of Freud's 1913 papers, that a boy popping his acne or his zits was thought to be of a sexual motivation, according to Freud in that paper, and some people thought that was really extreme. And so anyway, Simone de Beauvoir, a philosopher, she thought Freud, even though he denied his assertions being philosophical, he was still making philosophical assumptions, so that we need to question his sayings philosophically also. So the professor Rosaria Butterfield, she was also quoting from Michel Foucault, that she believes that Freud's assessment was a 19th century category mistake, that your sexual orientation is not part of a seamless core self that you're acting out of, such as if you were acting out of your core self, it would be like how you stir the soup or walk the dog, or there's no gay or straight way to walk the dog or stir the soup or pedal the bicycle or things like that. So in essence, you'd be arguing that you're a different kind of person if you had that view of sexual orientation. So she would say that's an error, and I would agree with that. It's not acting off of your core self. And then the two feminists I wanted to talk about are Judith Butler and Sally Haslanger. They are social constructionists, and you can see a short quote there from Judith Butler. The constructed status of gender is theorized as radically independent of sex, and that can be the most controversial part of it, that some people could be considered biologically male, for example, but be thought of as a female. And there's different examples of that, like the female impersonator that puts on an act as if he is a female, even though he's biologically male. Then there might be the transgender person that is in a male body but feels like he's a female. Those would be examples of that, how biological sex can be different from the perceived gender identity. And so that's why she calls it as gender performance. It's not some seamless, unified identity that we have. It's something that's stylized and repeated over time and has multiple factors coming together as to why it would be a performance. And she opposes, both of these oppose biology as destiny, as a formula. And then, like I have there, gender and gender expression is sometimes referred to a fiction, but that does not mean that it's not real. And one thing we can compare that to is, for example, even like legal fictions, like we have corporations and limited liability companies, and we wouldn't question about those things being real or not, that they're real, even though they're not flesh and blood things, but they still are entities or things we do not question whether they're real, because they are in the context of what we're referring to. And then Sally Haslanger also makes the comparison between race and gender, and the similar, even though there are a number of things that are dissimilar between race and gender, we do have a number of similarities which I think are instructive. on the comparisons, like sex and sexism and racism are all about behavior. So sexism would be like the misogynistic man who always puts down women, or and also compared to the racist who doesn't want those people moving into our neighborhood or marrying our daughters, or otherwise corrupting our neighborhood. So that those would be very similar comparisons with sexism and racism, or even maybe the black person trying to pass as white, or some black people might accuse other black people of saying, well, you're white in the middle, and black on the outside. So that would be kind of like a racial slur about someone of their own race, for example. And here's some history of what we construct as race. That's why we would say race is constructed. At the turn of the century, there were like 36 some schemes and 75 and other schemes of races, which now we currently classify as white often. And that's Matthew Fry Jacobson that gives that information. And at one time, it's interesting that even, for example, Italians were once considered non-white people. So at that time, in the 1900s, especially the early 1900s, there were pseudoscientific ideas of eugenics that were very popular, measuring heads and how far apart your eyes are, and your ears, and the slope of your face, things like that. So some others say scientific data, of course, is very complex and can be misinterpreted or misconstrued. And I think I've already mentioned a little about the color of the skin versus what it means to be black or white. And some countries have very different conceptions, like Brazil has a different conception of what we do here in the U.S. as being what it is to be black, or even consider in Africa the colored people versus the darker skinned people of sub-Saharan Africa. Those would be some differences on the way people are treated based on the color of their skin, and which would be like racism again. And then there's a number of stereotypes that we face for gender. Women aren't built like that, or men are not supposed to be overly sensitive. I think of the Charles Atlas commercial that was a long time ago. If any of you remember that, that may be telling my age, that the beach bully kicked the sand in his face, and he looked like this wimpy little guy. And when he discovered Charles Atlas's system, it built up his muscles, and then he could just punch that bully in the face, if he came up and bothered him anymore. So, and then the last section, intersectionality. None of us are one issue people. So the white woman and sexism would face a different experience than a black woman. That a black woman would also suffer from racism and sexism because she's both black and white. Things like that, or even a black male even though male sometimes is considered a more privileged status by a lot of people, he would still suffer racism because of his being black or perceived as black. And then the gender complementarity is the other side of the issue that many people accept. And gender complementarity means that they believe that these people adhere to believe the complementarity, or that the sexes complement not one another, or they're compatible with one another in a way that males and males or females and females are not. And so this first quote is a long quote by Elizabeth Elliot, which passed away last year. One person referred to her as the Grand Lady of Evangelicalism, if that helps you know who she is, or was. And I've used 3 different categories for gender complementarity by Dr. James Brownson, that teaches a professor at Western Seminary in Holland, Michigan. has a hierarchical, the anatomical, procreative, and the role-based. And you see all three of those subsets in Elizabeth Elliot's thinking about the first hierarchical. You could say wives submit to husbands, or some would also say, maybe not necessarily her, that women submit to men, and then the idea of the anatomical procreative is also mixed in that second statement, and then also the third one is roles for men and women. And she gave the example of when she was in South America, that she lived with the Aka Indians for a time, and they had some. She said they did not question their roles about what male and female are, but you can note from her description that a number of them were very different from what they are here in the U.S. So the women carried the heaviest loads. The men would not carry anything heavy if there was a woman around to do it for them. And that would be different from our perception of or many people's perception of what women ought to do. If there's a man around, he's stronger and he ought to carry the heavy load. That would be one example of that. So for me, it's kind of hard to see how role-based patterns fit what she's saying, that how they would transcend all cultures and how that would fit. But anyway, aside from that, I'll go on to the idea of what's called organism. The two sexes, the man and the woman, coming together in marriage, that to become a literal organism. The idea of the organism came about in the Enlightenment, and it matches Brownson's subset of complementary for procreative and anatomical complementarity. So the man and the woman in the conjugal relation specifically become an organic whole through the penis and vagina sex, for example. And the law professor and philosopher Robert George, he uses that idea heavily in his arguments for what is marriage, and those have a lot of commonality with some of Eliot's and others' arguments that use those type of thinking. So both ideas of the organism and natural law appear in our legal history and religious and philosophical historical traditions, is what the point I was trying to make on that. And Robert George has he did help draft, for example, the Federal Marriage Amendment and then some other, like an amicus brief for Focus on the Family. And so that was my point. They have a lot of ideas that are in common, and his view is called New Natural Law, which he still does see sex as being important in marriage as procreative, but he's also tried to allow other elements by using the reproductive type recognizing that there's other elements for intimacy in marriage anyway. Okay, and I just wanted to point out also there's multiple competing versions of natural law and complementary, and one German scholar said there were at least 50 versions of natural law. Robert Morey, that wrote a book on natural law and the problems with it, he believes there's over 200 versions. So on this one, we're specifically talking about Robert George's particular version on what I was trying to explain, and that Robert George does use religious language dressed up in secular terms, and then claims that his conclusions come through natural reasoning processes that people would come to without the aid of religious arguments. And so the problem with that, though, him using the one flesh argument, that is, some have pointed out that that's specifically a biblical term, and if you take out that term from his argument, then the argument loses much of its force. And so I see that being some of the main problems with his argument. And then, to summarize, gender as performance is referring mostly to either gender or the gender expression rather than the actions based on ideas of a seamless, core personality, such as Freud's category mistake that I was referring to earlier. So I hope that all makes sense to you. I know it's a lot of information.
It is. It's a power-packed PowerPoint. So we'll open it up now for questions, comments, objections, either on the presentation or if you had a chance to read the paper, you can refer specifically to things in the paper.
The question you're trying to answer is gender performance? Is that the question?
Yes.
Help me see both what your answer is and what the two alternative views have to do with it. I'm going to mention the alternative views first. I mean, complementarity, I don't know what bearing that has on it. I mean, suppose the complementarity people are right. Well, is gender performance not? What difference does it make? Provided that you have one person taking one role, one person taking the other. In the case of the organism idea, which I think has more to do with sex and sexual orientation, I don't see how that bears on gender at all. I mean, suppose the organism is a certain desirable or good in some sort of way. So, fair enough. Okay, well then, so these people would say that you want I don't know, difference with respect to sex and presumably sexual orientation. So that may be true or whatever, that may be their view. What does this have to do with gender? So, which has to do with identity. If I read you right. You see what I'm getting at? I'm trying to figure out what the question is and what the tension is, what the dialectic tension is.
Yes, I know.
The answer and the objection. You see, I'm being really crude about this.
Yeah, I know it's a very complex subject. I covered it only in a few minutes. So
So what's the question, first of all? Is it the one, is gender performance? Is that what we're trying to answer here? You're trying to answer here?
Yes, the difference between essentialist and constructionist, and I was trying to focus on that essentialist that emphasize a more biological basis. So
and your answer is essentialist bad, construction is good with respect to gender?
The essentialists, I think, are not taking into account that it's a much more complicated. One example I've heard is that think of if my speech even it's not that I have one speech gene in my head that allows me to speak. It's my brain, my mind, my vocal cords, my tongue, my mouth, my lips, all working together. So if you say, well, it's just a biological basis, then that's kind of missing the point of all these things working together. If I've learned English over time. I wasn't born speaking English, so it was an acquired trait that through repeated practice that I had, and then it's something I wouldn't lose other than brain trauma or some kind of brain damage, and then I could learn additional languages, like I worked on learning Spanish, but it's something that wouldn't be lost. So it's much more complicated than just saying it's biological. So and another point I wanted to make is the essentialist the ones that I'm referring to would say that sex can never be separated from gender, that it's they're always the same, but the difference on constructionists like Butler and Haslanger would say gender can be separated from sex, that you could be biologically male and still have the female, which some would call performance, especially the gender expression.
And your view on all this is what? It's complex.
Yes, it's complex, and I lean more towards that at least gender and gender expression, some of those things I don't see how you deny that they are socially constructed, even if you allow that it does have something of a biological basis. It's not one or the other. It's a complex mix of things.
What I'm not so clear on is whether these people who are disagreeing with you are saying that it's not socially constructed or that it shouldn't be. Two completely different questions. Are they saying that gender is never socially constructed, or did you say that it's a bad choice? You have two completely different questions, right?
Some people seem to be arguing that gender is never socially constructed,
Never.
especially like role based.
So which of these people are saying that?
More the essentialists that have the biological basis, or the ones that the religious. Some of the religious
How do they
people.
understand the situation when somebody is biologically one thing and then apparently something else? If it's not socially constructed, how do they explain it?
They just say they're mentally disturbed, or they've made it all up. It's a total fantasy that they're.
But society has nothing to do with it. It's not social.
If they're saying it's not socially constructed, some of them do say it's a total fantasy. It's
But
like
fantasies are
a
not
man
socially
that
constructed.
thinks he's a woman.
But fantasies are not socially constructed. There's
No,
something else.
no. They're not saying that's a total construction. They're not saying that's a social construction. They're saying that the person is confused, or they totally made this up, or have some kind of mental problem that.
That was what struck me, frankly, is the most interesting thing about your whole paper. So you didn't get into it at all. You sort of bracketed it. But this idea of what the heck a fantasy is, and are fantasies socially constructed? Are they good? Are they bad? I'm curious what the claim is, because I mean clearly these what do you call it, essentialists recognize that there are people who are biologically one thing, and then in what are we going to call it? In fact, in social fact, whatever we call it, in reality, something else as well. And I'm sure they could follow every single one of those divisions you make: sex, gender, expression, orientation. That makes perfect sense, and you can see how these are all variables. So what I don't understand is what they're disagreeing with you about.
Well, I think part of what you're asking, or you see, if I understand correctly, is that part of the controversy would also be over gender identity, whether the identity is valid or not, and Rebecca O'Reilly Cooper is doing a whole book on that. She calls it the doctrine of gender identity, and like I said, is writing a book on that, and that can be really complex trying to decide whether, well, is that, like I've already mentioned, a man that thinks he's a woman, or she's even seen like nonbinary.org website that gets all these, some of them claim a multiplicity of genders for I believe it's the social constructionists that also, some of them argue for that, but it can get into a tangled mess, and that's why it's going to be a whole book that she's writing about. Some have questioned, are there some identities that we could reject, and then also if it's, she gave an example of like a frost gender, or that has a cold and snowy day type of gender, and she says, why are we even calling that gender? Why aren't we calling that personality?
But I can reject, and you should reject. Is this an ethical question you're discussing, basically?
That some identities could be
No, obviously it could be rejected. I mean,
or maybe should be rejected.
That's really what's at issue with the essentialists.
They
They recognize that this is a reality, that people are like this.
Yes.
The question is, are they erring in some way? Is that the
Yes, maybe that's a better way of saying it. Some identities should be rejected.
I think I understand your question.
Okay.
Were you saying that some should be on the performance view rejected, like you talked about? Just to consider an example, so we sometimes have people who go against all social pressures and expectations, right? And maybe an effeminate boy or a masculine girl who who maybe disappoint their parents with this, and maybe are abused by their peers for this, and so on, and yet they do it anyway, which seems to suggest biological cause. I think, even if it's aberrant biological cause, but whether to classify it as aberrant or acceptable diversity. Right.
Okay, well, some things you're referring
It's
to
an
are
ethical
gender
question.
expression, like some person's gender expressions
Yeah,
would not be accepted or would not be acceptable. So, but as far as the gender identity, what they think or what they feel they are, some identities I think should be rejected, or I would question whether they should be rejected. One example that's made the news and people have made comments on is like the person that's a biological man that's 6'1", but he's left his wife and family to live with another family with little kids and claims he's a perpetual 6-year-old girl. I would think that does sound rather odd to me.
well, it sounds odd, but I wonder what standard we could use to say which ones are aberrant or invalid or unacceptable, and which ones are, and which deviations are within an acceptable range. Or that's all ethical.
Yeah, yes, that's a good question, and it's probably not something that could be answered in just a few minutes.
No, I'm sure it couldn't, but I wondered
that's why she's writing a whole book on that.
I just wondered if the performance view had special sorts of implications for that kind of debate.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very good question. Yes.
Carol, thank you for your paper. So I want to talk, I guess I just want you to clarify, if you would, the distinction you make between a thing being real and subjective versus it being objective. So we actually were talking about this in my philosophy of religion class earlier today.
Mm-hmm.
You might think there's a really good example of things that we count as real, but we wouldn't call them objective. They're rooted in like attitudes and practices and agreements we all have.
Right.
Right, and so they're no less real, they just have a different kind of grounding, right?
Yes.
So an example is like money, right? Everyone loves $20 bills, $100 bills, but if the world ended and there were no human beings, those things would not hold value. In fact, the only reason they do hold value is because we all agree to exchange them for goods and services at an agreed upon rate, right?
Right.
But nobody would deny that money is a real thing. If you deny that to your landlord, you will be out on the street, right?
Yes.
So, so suppose it is true that gender and gender identity or gender expression is socially constructed.
Mm-hmm.
That would not by itself suggest anything about it being real or unreal, right? I mean, I guess that's a conclusion I'm drawing. Is that, would you agree with that? Do you think that's also true based on the research you've done? We would count it as real, whether it's socially constructed.
Yeah. Yes. You'd want to ask in what sense is it real, or what
Sure.
do we mean by real? And don't want to lose my train of thought here. I also think some of those things can come into category mistakes, like what we talked about in some of the philosophy of mind when I took that David's class. You know, that came in handy too. Like, for example, the Hayes Public Library. If all I saw was a building with a bunch of books in it, I mean, it's there isn't any Hayes Public Library. Or in what sense is the Hayes Public Library real? You know. But,
above and beyond the collection of buildings. Or
yeah. Yes. That it's more than just books and rooms, and there's people that work here. There's a legal structure. I read at the front door, Hayes Public Library Trust. You know, there's a complicated mix on what makes Hayes Public Library real in that sense. You know.
So you think it would? So I mean, I guess my question is, on your view, it would be acceptable to, I mean, referring to gender as constructed does not, remove or deflate it from reality, or otherwise have what we thought was essential or biological. Is that your view?
Yeah. Yes, I think that would be accurate to say that.
Thank you.
One question.
Yes.
when someone performs male or female, the role they're playing, are they playing a historically constructed role, as in like I'm expressing myself as a woman and this is just how women have typically expressed themselves in the world? Or are they expressing, like if I express myself in a masculine way, am I pretending to have certain biological traits that men have? Or am I pretending to be as men have historically presented themselves in the world? Does that question make sense?
I think so. I'll try to answer that.
Can you recast the question first? How do you understand it?
Um,
Well, I think Carol. How do
Okay.
you understand what she said?
Yes.
No, he wants you.
Well, I just want to
Okay,
what question you're answering. Yeah.
So it's you're asking about a kind of a people that hold a kind of a biological basis versus the social constructionist.
I'm asking about the concept of gender performance. So
Gender
when someone
performance.
performs, what are they performing exactly?
It's the gender expression that they can feel like either a man or a woman. That's a deeply held. It can be a deeply held sense of who they think they are, but it's still not a seamless some kind of seamless core self that they're acting out of. So let's see, how do I want to say that? And as an expression, I know Butler gives the example of gender as being like a stylized, repeated actions. That's what gender is built out of, and then since it's so complicated, I think that's why it's been divided up into gender and gender identity and gender expression and those things. I'm trying to think if I can answer it better than that. Does that partially answer your question at least?
Maybe to a small degree. I'm curious about, so say I identify as male, whatever that means, and I perform as male. What am I identifying with?
As far as gender
Yeah, so I'm a
expression,
woman who feels like a man, right? What am I feeling that is characteristically male? I guess I just don't
what
understand
are
the
they
concept.
feeling that is?
Yeah, like what makes me perform male as opposed to perform female? When I feel like a male and I express myself like a male, what is that like?
I know people. I'm sure people do this for different reasons. What their expression is. So some of it could be a dissatisfaction with the roles that society. I'm sure it's more than just one thing. So that's just part of what it may be. That they have a dissatisfaction of the types stereotypes men have, like men don't cry, men shouldn't be overly sensitive. They ought to be muscular. Let's see, one thing I heard somebody say one time is, our grandfathers never worried about having six-pack abs, but maybe they're just being, a lot of things are just being pressed on them that they're wanting to reject. But I'm sure there's other factors along with that also. Or you think of maybe even with females, that anorexia is very common. That the real female is a really ultra thin female and is expected to do certain things. Does that help any?
Sort of. Thank you.
Okay.
Carolyn, I haven't read the room, but I wonder, have you looked at, and if also kind of similar to that, but have you looked at or thought about kind of like someone who identifies as transgender versus someone who does more drag, and like how does that play into his gender performance?
Yes, there would be different reasons why there's the gender expression, or in other words, the gender performance. The female impersonator is obviously doing it for some reason, like there's a profit or being paid to do it, and then in the other case, where in a transgender person where the biological male feels like a female, he's doing it for other reasons that he believes that's what he really is, or feels best fits his what he thinks he is or thinks himself to be. And like I said, it's multiple factors, not just one or two things.
Surely gender can be performance, right? I mean, take the example of drag or whatever. I mean, I guess my gender is man.
Okay.
But, I mean, I guess I could do woman. I'd think about it and work on it, and I could probably pull it off. Well, it would be the greatest, but I'm not the greatest actor. But it would be an interesting experiment. I would think it through, and I'd have to get some feedback. It's like learning like I play violin. Not easy, but you could probably do it. I could teach violin. Maybe someone could teach me woman. Suppose I did that. Okay, so I did. In that case, clearly gender would be performed, or at least clearly from my point of view. Now here's where it gets interesting. Suppose it becomes second nature. The violin's an interesting example. I'm a violinist. I'm using that example speaking of some knowledge. It is now. I never practiced much. Don't get me wrong.
Okay.
But I've been at it for a long time. So it has actually become second nature. Just so I can speak English, just so I can sort of shape the word. I don't even know what I'm doing. It's just coming out English. It can come out violin. It can't come out oboe. I can't do that. Yeah. But that's just the thing. See, once it becomes second nature, is it right to call it performance anymore? Am I performing English right now? I don't know. I'm just talking to you guys. You know what I'm saying? And I can do the same thing with violin. Is it right to call? I mean, if it becomes part of you, it seems weird to call it performance. I guess it strikes me as just a very crude term. It would be performance in the short term if I did woman. If it caught on though, if I liked it, if it became second nature,
It becomes deeper than performance.
what's that?
It becomes deeper than performance.
Yeah, I mean, it would just be English, or whatever the analog would be.
It's still constructed, right?
Well, it began constructed, but then it's just me.
Well, but you can't talk to yourself.
What's that?
You would still be talking to other people. There would be a social component.
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah, I guess you can call it performance if you want. I mean, are we just talking nurture nature? Is that what we're talking about here? Because
Well, I think it's more than the nature versus nurture, and then you said gender as performance. I think that's why in the paper that one of the papers that Judith Butler wrote, that she really stressed the difference between gender identity and gender expression. That's really one of the core things of some of her points.
expression and identity. This is in your paper. Is this where you make the distinction between not man and woman, masculine, feminine? Is that the terminology you use? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's
sure,
like
that's
like
true.
you got.
Yeah, I mean, sure. They're relatively feminine guys, masculine girls. Sure, yeah, sure.
Or you are biologically male and you happen to identify as a
I
man.
remember that part of your paper as just being actually crystal clear. I understood
Okay.
that totally. I
Okay.
understood. It's complicated. I mean, it's
Yes.
frankly really
Yes.
complicated. But
Yes, it is.
since when is truth not complicated? I mean, that's fine. The difficulty is when I get into the questions of value, I guess.
Mhm.
Like, I mean, if I understand your question is, should, let's call them sex-gender mismatches, be rejected, resisted, opposed, or embraced, accepted? That question. I mean, that they exist is, that's clear. And the terminology is helpful. But I don't know. I'm not sure what these essentialist people, I couldn't tell based on what you've written, what they're actually saying. Are they saying that it causes more trouble than it's worth? Do you understand the sex-gender mismatch, using your terminology, what I meant? So where they're not, whatever. What's your terminology? Male, man, woman, female. Those would be matches if you swap them. Because you're not really talking about sexual orientation. That's not really what this paper is about. It's about Gender.
My primary
sex.
focus is the gender identity versus the gender
All right.
expression.
So what is any argument that's given against this being like a good idea or in favor of it being a bad idea? What are these people saying? Either the organism people or what's the other one? The essentialist people. I'm still trying to get clear on this.
Well, I would see the people that argue for the organism are part of the essentialist camp that focus on the
Those are the
biological
same
basis.
people, kind of.
Yes, sir. Not everybody takes exactly the same position. There's nuances to the discussion, but yes, I put the organism people in the essentialist camp that focus on biology.
From their point of view, if you have a male woman and a female man who are heterosexual, whatever, they get together. Would this be something? Would they have any complaint with this? I mean, you have all the complementarity you want, just with mixed matches.
Well, the point of like George's argument for the organism and complementary people of the same sex or all of this other gender ideas that I'm talking about, he would say that that's invalid. It has to be a man and a woman, and I think he would argue that people of the same sex can't have that same kind of complementarity. It has to be a penis, vagina sex.
Well, that wouldn't be maximum complementarity. That would be you'd be compromising. You'd be having only part. But I mean, you could have all sorts of mismatching, but still have complementarity. Just you need to switch the variables. You know what I'm saying, right? I don't know. I assume it happens. World being complicated the way it is.
Yeah.
Would they have any case against this?
Well, George would say that it's only a man and a woman that can meet these ideas of complementarity.
You still have that if you wanted. You can have a man and a woman, but let's imagine the man is female, and
So if you had a transgender man and a woman,
You say this better.
transgender male and a transgender female who have not had gender reassignment surgery,
Mhm.
if the two of them were to come together to have sex, they each, one identifies as man and has a vagina, the other one identifies as a woman, has a penis.
Thank you. Said this very well.
Can they still do the complementarity?
You'd have all the difference in the world.
Right.
Exactly.
I would.
Is that your
Yeah,
question?
yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, very good. Now, my understanding of George and others that think like him would be that cannot happen. The gender cannot be separated from your biological sex, and then only a
Gender
man
is
and a
identical.
woman in marriage
Oh,
can
they're-
make up the
Yeah, it's
organism.
just the same thing.
Oh, is that were you affirm what you just said?
Yeah, so for George and other essentialists, gender is just identical with sex. There is no real distinction between them, or at least there should be ideally, and if there is, it's not a matter of sort of this just kind of benign differentiation, it's pathological.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
something is
It's not
wrong.
that it isn't, but it shouldn't be. Is there-
So one person might just say they are identical, and if you think otherwise, you've just deceived yourself about something.
Yes, that's the way a lot of them put it.
And,
yes.
don't the ones who give secular arguments come out of a natural law sort of?
Yes, like George uses a new natural law version, and like I've already mentioned, there's many different versions of natural laws, as you probably already know.
So as I understand your exchange with Doug, this does seem to be primarily an ethical question. And you raised an issue early on about the person who plays the 6-year-old child who
Yes.
have some reservations about that.
Yes.
So on what grounds do you do that? So you don't like the correlation between sex and gender, you want to separate those, but you don't want to use a natural law argument, which George does. So how do you then identify acceptable cases of this, and like the 6-year-old child, which you consider to be unacceptable, and then when is it okay and when is it not okay to play another role, or to identify as another role? How do you make that distinction?
Yes, I think that's definitely falls with an ethical issue. Well, I would assume from what I know about the man, when he got married, he did make marriage vows to his wife and make commitments to his children, and then on what basis does he negate his vows and go off and decide to live with another family and live with another family and well, I guess it depends on who you're asking, because some people think his identity ought to be accepted, but that just sounds very questionable to me on those ethical.
But
Kinds of
that
questions,
same
yes.
argument would apply for most divorces.
Yeah, yes, I agree.
So you'd have to oppose a divorce on the same sort of grounds.
Yes, or was it okay
You
to,
made a vow to your husband or wife, and so you want to stick to it.
and was it okay to go off and live with another woman or whoever?
So
Yes.
aside from gender questions, that same argument would apply to divorce.
Okay, I see two hands up.
Sorry, Carol, what would a constructionist say about somebody who performed in an alternate way to their biological sex, but who on growing old had Alzheimer's and forgot what they learned? Like they forgot how to play the violin and how to ride a bicycle, and they forgot their name. Are they still performing?
Wow. That's really an interesting question.
It's part of the Bible.
Yes, I hadn't thought much about that one, I think, but that's a good question though. So they have some kind of mental, like dementia or senile or something like that, where their brain is deteriorated. Is that kind of the idea of what you're saying?
Sure, and I'm not trying to stump you. I'm just asking, is gender performance? That is.
I think it still would be, but yes, their conception of their identity. Since I'm dealing with mostly gender identity and gender expression, yes, I think it could very well change if they had their brain was deteriorating. They may even go back to a childlike state. I've seen that happen working in a nursing home. That some of the people suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's, they go back to years ago when they were younger. Or
Sure, and in a parallel fashion, the old man who thinks he's a 6-year-old, if he experiences that, say in old age, is he put in a children's hospital or is he sent to a regular nursing home? You see what I'm saying?
yes, I think that's one basis also, as you're pointing out, that probably the identity could be questioned, or whether you could get into legal issues, whether he's mentally competent or able to take care of himself, things like that. Yes.
Yeah, so people have pointed out that there does seem to be an obvious ethical dimension here that seems right. But when you talk, and perhaps you went to the other side of this, I'm sorry. When you talk performance, I think aesthetics. And I wonder to what extent, and especially when someone said, well, this is a performance, well, there's good performances and bad performances, right? And there are, so to even call, maybe the word is distracting or something, but,
Okay.
but I'm thinking aesthetic terms, so I guess, is there, never mind the ethical element, if the normativity is there, could it be aesthetic normativity? Like you're doing this performance badly, or you're performing badly. So it seems to me that this is as much an aesthetic question as it is an ethical one.
I suppose it would depend on why they're doing the performance. Again, like going to the band that's dressing in drag, maybe he's doing it to earn money or part of his living, or it could be an aesthetic performance in that sense. But I think that's one reason why it's better expressed as gender expression,
Right.
rather than performance, because the word performance has all these other loaded ideas in the definition. I think that's okay.
So essentialism then is that you're sort of objectively this way. And I'm thinking about the cases where somebody says something like, I feel like a man trapped in a woman's body. I'm really a woman, or I'm really a man, but my body is wrong. It's not the one I need. That's almost an essentialist argument, right? It's almost a claim that my gender is wrong because it doesn't match up with, or my sex is wrong. Or something. So is that person almost defending a kind of an essentialist notion that it's not just me choosing this, but that if I want to be correct, I need to choose sex?
There might be a few things like that where essentialists and constructionists might have a few points of agreement, but then after that they can widely differ on the nuances of the discussion.
Yeah, you probably know about this. There are cases of gender ambiguity at birth.
Yes.
That surgeons have made a decision that this will be a boy or a girl and done something surgical about that.
Right.
And then people will sometimes say later they got it wrong.
Yes.
They made the wrong choice
Yes.
when they decided to determine this person male or determine this person female surgically when they were babies. And but that seems to suggest that there is such a thing as getting it right. And if that's the way to think about it, then the right here is something biological here, isn't it, or something?
Well, the constructionists like Judith Butler or Hasslinger, they don't deny biological influence, and
Right.
then there's that Fausto Sterling I referred to in the paper. She's considered a gender specialist, that she feels like it's a complex mix, and I think she's aware of some of these cases where the person, they call it intersex. I know it used to be called hermaphrodite, but
Yeah.
intersex people, and there are examples of people who didn't even know they were intersex. Like there are women who have given birth to children, but that when they've had their chromosomes tested, or their XY chromosomes, they find out they actually have Y chromosomes as well as the X chromosomes. There can be a man that finds out he has extra chromosomes, and that tends to end up being that he's infertile, and he finds out after he gets tested that was why, that he's chromosomally intersex, things like that. So it can be quite complicated.
Yeah, often though, when people just say they got it wrong, they just are looking at the psychology. They just see.
Yeah, either psychology or just
they
the
got
biology.
they got determined male, and all they want to do is play with Barbie, and that kind of
Mhm.
and so they say they got it wrong. In that kind of case. I don't know.
Maybe time for one more quick question. We're on time. All right. Well, I encourage you to join me in